It's my great pleasure to welcome you to the 2011 Acton Lecture on Religion and Freedom of the Centre for Independent Studies, which I head. This is the first in a 10-day long series of events at the Centre, the details of most being on our website. It's also my pleasure in particular to welcome our speaker tonight, Senator David Coltart, Zimbabwe's Minister for Education, Sports, Arts and Culture, to this auditorium for tonight's lecture, part of the Parliament that contains, as I understand it, the oldest extant parliamentary chamber in the Westminster tradition. I'd also like to welcome the Zimbabwean High Commissioner, or Ambassador, here tonight as well. So thank you very much, and everyone else for being here. The format for tonight is that following my remarks, our speaker will speak for about 35 minutes or so, and there'll be a question period followed by a concluding vote of thanks to be delivered by the Reverend Peter Curti, a visiting fellow at CIS. I might say that the lecture and all the bits that go with it are being filmed and recorded. If you're shy, it's probably best you don't put your hand up. So we will be handing around microphones to record the questions. We will put this on our website, so that's the reason we're doing the filming. For a number of years, the Centre had a program of studies entitled Religion and the Free Society, of which the Acton Lecture was a component. For a strictly secular organisation, which we are, this was considered to be a fairly interesting development. However, a core feature of the Centre's work has been to examine the role of voluntary institutions in a free and open civil society, and it seemed to us that the churches and religions more generally were an important component of this and worthy of some attention. The program ended about 7 or 8 years ago when its then director, Sam Gregg, moved to the United States, in fact to the Acton Institute, but we decided to continue the Acton Lecture as an annual feature of the CIS calendar. You may also be interested to know that we have in fact begun to re-establish some other activities in the program, and you may hear a little bit about that later on. The purpose of this lecture is not, I must stress, to discuss internal matters of discipline, dogma or organisation with which all faiths and all churches wrestle from time to time. Instead, it offers a platform from a secular institution for prominent individuals to offer their own reflections on issues affecting aspects of religion in the modern world and to inform the public about various aspects of this and how it interacts with the free society. They may not be active in religious affairs. They may not even be religious, but bring to the issues some important perspectives. David Coltart was born in Gweru, Zimbabwe, and when young, with his family relocated to Bulawayo, where he now lives. After school and the obligatory period of national service, he enrolled at the University of Cape Town in 1978 and pursued a successful legal career in Zimbabwe. He moved into politics as legal secretary to the newly formed Movement for Democratic Change in 1999, of which he was a founding member. In the 2000 election, he unseated ZANU-PF MP for Bulawayo South, after which he served as Shadow Justice Minister. After the MDC split in 2005, David was the only member to remain impartial in an effort to reconcile the opposing factions. In the March 2008 Senate election, he won the seat of Kumalo and is now Minister of Education, Sport, Arts and Culture in the coalition government of National Unity that was sworn in February 2009. He has fought passionately in Parliament and the courts for justice and human rights in Zimbabwe. David is married to Jenny and has 4 children, and as you would expect from a Minister for Sport, a passionate follower of rugby, cricket and golf and just about everything else. It's my pleasure to invite Senator Coltart to address us.
Thank you, Greg, and good evening to everyone. This coming September will be the 10th anniversary of the horrors of 9/11, which was one of the world's worst assaults on freedom in the name of religion. The greatest freedom is a life lived without fear. The 9/11 attacks left people, particularly those in the West, with the sense that there was nowhere safe left and that no one is immune from attack. The random and massive attacks on civilians far from any theatre of war in New York and London and elsewhere, have severely curtailed freedoms of people right across the globe. The West's reaction to these assaults on freedom has been dominated by an extreme but understandable preoccupation with security, which ironically is meant to protect freedom. Australia itself has been drawn into costly wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, which have also taken the lives of many precious young Australians. The United States has diverted a vast amount of its international resources and attention to these same wars, which have undoubtedly had domestic consequences such as its massive domestic debt. Despite these efforts to protect freedom, I read a report last week that said that the United States is now more unpopular than ever in the Middle East. And presumably it follows that the security threat against US citizens is just as grave as it was 10 years ago. If that is correct, it is a tragic indictment on Western foreign policy. But the indictment against the West's foreign policy goes further than that. Despite the infusion of trillions of dollars of Western aid into Africa in the last 50 years, much of that has been squandered. And there's no better example than what has happened in my own country, Zimbabwe, in the last 30 years. In the 1980s, for example, hundreds of millions of dollars were spent by the West on building up infrastructure in Zimbabwe's education sector. And as I know too well, most of these buildings are now in a serious state of disrepair. And when I took over my office 2 years ago, the education sector was in a state of extreme crisis. This has happened because, ironically, Lord Acton's adage that power tends to corrupt and absolute power corrupts absolutely has not been a part of Western foreign policy. Money was poured into Zimbabwe unconditionally, and in the face of massive human rights violations, including a genocide in the 1980s, and very little of that investment was spent in attempts to promote democracy and freedom in Zimbabwe. As a consequence, power has been abused, and as we've seen in the last decade, the economy has all but collapsed, in turn rendering the destruction and, in most cases, almost complete deterioration of what has been built up with Western aid. I would argue, and that is the relevance of tonight's address, that key Christian principles have been disregarded in the formulation of Western foreign policy for decades. And from Vietnam to Afghanistan, it does not appear to me as if many lessons have been learnt, because these mistakes are being repeated even today. Ladies and gentlemen, the reason I focus on the West is partly because it remains the most powerful collective of nations in the world, and partly because the West and its history is rooted in Christendom. I should also stress at the outset that I don't solely blame the West. Far from it, because of course countries such as my own are to blame and must share the blame for the near total destruction of our own economy. But tonight my remarks are directed towards a predominantly Western audience, and so that will remain my focus. I need also mention right at the outset that my use of the phrase "the West is problematic and flawed," because the West is obviously not homogeneous, and the foreign policy of countries within the West differ greatly, and many countries do not have foreign policies which suffer from the problems I will speak of. I need to place my remarks this evening in a personal context. At the outset, let me say that I do not consider myself religious, in the sense that I do not slavishly follow a particular denomination or sect. But I do believe in a personal God who I believe is the very essence of freedom. 30 years ago, I came to place my trust in the historical Jesus Christ. I was challenged by the point made by the English philosopher and Christian, C.S. Lewis, that this historical man, and I emphasize historic because no one seriously disputes the historical fact of Christ having lived and died, but that this historical man was either who he said he was or he was a lunatic. Given the deep wisdom of Christ's teaching, it was impossible for me to think of him as a lunatic. I was also deeply moved by the writings of Frank Morrison in a book called Who Moved the Stone, which in essence forced me to consider the historical reality of Christ's crucifixion and the growth of the church as we know it out of what, if one doesn't believe in the resurrection, was an absolute disaster. The historical fact of Christ's crucifixion is also a constant reminder to me that the desire for justice is one of the most constant elements of God's character. For it is in the very cross that we are reminded that the death of Christ was the sentence for all the evil perpetrated by mankind down through the ages. I need also say that by the church, I don't refer to the physical church of historical times and of today, but rather of the body of all the individual people who have placed their trust in Christ over the ages. The church is comprised of those who've placed their trust in Christ, not in the physical institutions created by man. Whilst I appreciate the great architecture of magnificent churches and, for example, the glorious singing that takes place in them, I fear that the very institutions of the church sometimes work to undermine Christ's teachings, that God's kingdom is not something that we can watch and see coming, and that there should be as well a very clear separation between church and state. In short, what I'm advocating this evening is not for any official status theocracy or the rigid application of Christian principles in the formulation of foreign policy. Likewise, I don't believe for a moment in the notion of Christian states or that the church can dictate to secular governments what their foreign policy should be. I would simply argue that certain biblical truths have been neglected in the formulation of Western foreign policy. Lincoln's second inaugural address, delivered on the 4th of March, 1865, makes some profound statements relevant to this topic today. His focus in that address was on the cause of the American Civil War, namely slavery, which constituted, in Lincoln's words, a peculiar and powerful interest to both sides in the conflict. Lincoln observed that both sides read the same Bible and pray to the same God, and each, according to Lincoln, each invoked his aid, that is God's aid, against the other. He also noted somewhat wryly that the prayers of both North and South could not be answered, that of neither has been answered fully, because the Almighty has his own purposes. In addressing the causes of the war, Lincoln referred to Christ's statement recorded in Matthew 18:7 as follows, which reads, "Woe to the world because of the things that cause people to sin. Such things must come, but woe to the man through whom they come." He assumed in these statements that God viewed slavery as a sin, and that the Civil War was the woe due to those, both North and South, responsible for that sin. He concluded with these memorable words, and I quote, "If God wills that it," namely the war, "continue until all the wealth piled by the bondman's 250 years of unrequited toil shall be sunk, and until every drop of blood drawn from the lash shall be paid by another drawn with the sword, so it must be said, the judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether." Now these thoughts, to put it mildly, I have no doubt, are rather unfashionable and certainly politically incorrect today. The thought that there are certain sins so objectionable to God that he is prepared to work great suffering on those responsible for them no doubt offends many modern thinkers. It is hard to imagine any current American leader who would be prepared to advance such thoughts. But the fact is that Lincoln clearly believed in the notion that God abhors and judges sin of nations, not just sins of individuals. What is also noteworthy is that earlier in his address, Lincoln observed that the South wanted to strengthen, perpetuate, and extend slavery, and significantly that the North merely, I quote, "claimed no right more than to restrict the territorial enlargement of slavery." In other words, because the North did not abhor slavery sufficiently to be fundamentally opposed to it, its sin was the sin of indifference. That observation, tied to the lament that God wanted to punish both acts of commission and omission, and in the case of the North's indifference to the suffering of slaves, and that God was delivering judgment, therefore, on the North as well as the South because of its indifference. Lincoln is arguably America's greatest president. He is universally revered in the United States and throughout the West for his great wisdom in steering the United States through its gravest hour. If he were alive today and applied the same principles today as he applied in that second inaugural address, what would he say? What would the national and international sins of the world be today? Those Lincoln would fear would be the object of God's wrath and judgment. Might he have argued that America's costly wars in Vietnam and Iraq were, to go back to the Bible, woes due to those by whom the offense came? It is in this context that I venture to suggest that critical mistakes, if not sins, have been committed by some countries in the West in the formulation of their foreign policy since the Second World War. It is my belief that Christ's teachings have some profound statements to make in the formulation of Western foreign policy, which are designed to protect, fundamentally, freedom. The first concern I have is summed up in the phrase of Christ, "Blessed are the peacemakers." This concerns what I term a reliance on military might over principle and morality. I vividly recall the triumphant shock and awe demolition of Baghdad in 2003, followed by President George W. Bush's claim that the war in Iraq was effectively over. I fear that we see a similar attitude being displayed now by NATO forces in the demolition of Tripoli. I should stress that I am not a pacifist, and nor do I, by any stretch of imagination, hold any brief for Colonel Gaddafi. Indeed, I loathe what he has done in Libya and loathe the negative influence that he has had right across Africa in the last 30 to 40 years. I also recognize the extreme dilemma the world has faced in dealing with dictators like Gaddafi. But nevertheless, my fear is simply that the West appears to trust more in its own military superiority than it does in the consistent moral force of principle. A resort to force seems to be the rapid default position of some countries in the West when their national interests are threatened. And yet when force is crucially and critically needed, but there's no national interest at stake, as was the case in Rwanda, that superior force is not employed. Although Martin Luther King spoke these words over 40 years ago in the context of the Cold War, they are arguably even more applicable today. He said, "The large power blocks of the world talk passionately of pursuing peace while burgeoning defense budgets bulge, enlarging already awesome armies and devising even more devastating weapons." In that context, I also wonder whether some of the new devastating weapons, which were not around 40 years ago, are even effective. And I wonder sometimes whether they may not even ironically make the West more insecure. Drones and stealth bombers cannot prevent the atrocities we have seen perpetrated against citizens in the last decade, and may even inflame terrorists to do more remote control killings of their own. My argument is not that the countries which have them should abandon these technologies, but rather that it is misleading to think that these are primarily where the West's security lies. A related concern is that because the West appears to trust in its military might, it pours a vast amount of its resources into the military, rather than directing more of its resources into what I believe ultimately are the root causes of most international turmoil today, namely poverty and a lack of education. Once again, Martin Luther King is devastating in his analysis. He said, "A nation that continues year after year to spend more money on military defense than on programs of social uplift is approaching spiritual death." I wonder how different the world would be if all the money paid to prop up and arm corrupt regimes in the last 3 decades had been, for example, spent on building a free press and in constructing schools and hospitals in the benighted countries some Western countries have fought wars in since the Second World War. I spoke at the outset of this address about the recent survey done in the Middle East, which shows that the United States, if this report is to be believed, is now more unpopular in the Middle East than ever before. In other words, for all the billions of dollars spent in fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the root objective namely to make the United States safer, has perhaps not been achieved. For so long as there is a perception that the West is motivated by self-interest, such as securing sources of oil, rather than by a genuine desire to uplift the people of those regions, the fertile ground for Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations in the world will grow. It seems to me that the West's greatest long-term security lies in doing what it can to remove the sting of grinding poverty and ignorance in the breeding grounds of terrorism. That sting which motivates terrorists and provides terrorist leaders with deep reservoirs of angry young men. That is why fair trade policies and development assistance, particularly investment in education of both women and men, is so vitally important to the stability and security that the West seeks so desperately at this time. History also shows that when raw military power is used aggressively in pursuit of a flawed cause, it ultimately fails. All the military power of the Nazis, the Soviets, the Americans in Vietnam, let me say the Rhodesians in Rhodesia against nationalist guerrilla forces, and the apartheid regime, ultimately lost to the sheer will and courage of weaker military forces who had a more just cause. Not that they had an absolutely just cause, but a more just cause. Going back to Lincoln and the American Civil War is also instructive. The South clearly had the better generals, but that didn't help them prevail. The North had overwhelming economic might, but initially it lost a series of battles. One could argue that it was only the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation on the 1st of January 1863 that the North started to get the upper hand, and major victories such as the Battle of Gettysburg in July 1863 gave new impetus to those on the side of right. The point is simply that mere military superiority alone is not sufficient to win wars. Ultimately, history shows that there needs to be a superior moral principle for a cause to prevail. Some argue that if we are to prevent war and if we are to deter evil regimes, it is important that democratic nations should maintain military superiority. That in turn is then used to justify massive military spending. I don't advocate for a massive reduction in military spending, but think that at the very least, Western development budgets need to be substantially increased, and that can be done on the back of reductions in defense spending. And we must remember that even the shocking state of ill preparedness of the United Kingdom and the Commonwealth in the face of rising Nazi power was ultimately insufficient to prevent good from prevailing over evil. In short, in the most important war that the world has waged in the last 100 years, underspending by those on the side of right did not ultimately prevent God's justice from prevailing. Coming closer to home, many people in Zimbabwe, and I'm sure many of you in Australia, fret about the fact that ZANU-PF still controls the military, which in turn has vastly more raw military power than what is at the disposal of those fighting to bring about a more democratic order in Zimbabwe. However, for all that ZANU-PF and the military establishment have thrown at us in the last 10 years, and for all the resources that they still have at their disposal, including diamonds, the fact remains that after 10 years of non-violent struggle, they are weaker than ever and getting weaker. Our campaign, which is based on non-violence, has been long and hard, but I am more confident than ever that that non-violent campaign is going to succeed. I believe as long as we strive to do what is right, the raw military power will not prevail in Zimbabwe over forces for good. War and the use of violence are manifestations of sin. It is our failure to resolve disputes both between and within nations peacefully, which results in war. War and the use of violence have been glorified by politicians down through the ages, but stripped of its propaganda, it is as much a consequence of the fall of mankind as is disease. Accordingly, war and violence should always be used as a last resort, which sadly is rarely the case in the world today. Peaceful means of resolving strife should also be given a chance. In 2008 in Zimbabwe, we chose a flawed political settlement precisely to avoid Zimbabwe from being plunged into a bloody civil war. Sadly, there are still to this day some Western countries which have not supported that process, and in doing so are undermining our chances of making this non-violent process work. My second concern this evening is summed up in the other biblical statement of Jesus Christ, in which he says also in Matthew, the kingdom of God is forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. This concern relates to what I perceive as a failure to trust that God will ultimately honor and be on the side of good. Many in the increasingly secular West do not even believe in God, so it's not surprising that there's so little reliance in the notion that ultimately a sovereign God will prevail in attaining justice and equity on earth. I have no doubt that, as I've said before, that it is the same lack of trust which contributes to massive Western military budgets. The feeling that unless man alone plans for the future, there can be no security. In Matthew 11, Jesus makes the statement that I read out. The kingdom of God is forcefully advancing, and forceful men lay hold of it. Jesus makes the statement in the context of John the Baptist's prophetic ministry and John the Baptist's harassment. What he highlights in this statement is the principle of the universal experience of opposition, which was characterized in John the Baptist's entire life, which, as we know, ultimately culminated in his beheading. John experienced opposition throughout his ministry, but it did not stop him from continuing that ministry, and it never confused him. He did what was right, suffered for it, and God did not rescue from it on earth. Jesus states that this is what all Christians must expect. As happened to John, and has happened in countless circumstances since then, God's judgment on the evil acts of evil men is often delayed. Evil men, namely the forceful men laying hold of God's kingdom, go from bad to worse. We've seen that throughout the world in the last decades, doing what they like, boasting of their disdain for God and his standards and his principles, and apparently getting away with it. Christians cry out to God for help, and his answer is often, in fact, usually unendurably slow. That has certainly been the case in Zimbabwe. But God's blessings are often hidden, even in the time of his ministry on earth. The miracles that Jesus did were never so blindingly obvious that they compelled belief. If people were determined not to believe, there was always a way in which they could explain away what Jesus had done and so justify their unbelief. That is true today in a different way, as we can consider God's means of dispensing justice in the world. If we have eyes to see, we can witness to the wonderful ways in which God has delivered justice in this time. The last 100 years have witnessed the collapse and destruction of Nazi fascism, Soviet communism, apartheid, and the downfall of numerous dictatorial regimes. Virtually all these evils have been defeated after long and tortuous struggles. And many have been brought down by inferior forces. Indeed, the parable of the mustard seed and the invocation for us to be salt and light are reminders that God very rarely uses the strong and powerful to achieve his purposes. He generally uses the weak and insignificant, and he generally puts forces of good through enormous suffering in fighting evil. Jesus had all the power to confront Herod, but he turned his attention to 12 simple, humble, and timid men. But it was those 12 men who ultimately turned the world upside down and changed it forever. Paul almost certainly met and challenged Nero, the greatest and most awesome ruler of his time. Slavery was eventually defeated through the efforts of relatively powerless men like Wilberforce over decades. Lincoln himself is a case in point. At the second inaugural address I've spoken about, the journalist Noah Brooks described him as a tall, pathetic, melancholy figure. Lincoln came from a poor background, and yet God used him mightily. In short, God tends to do the unexpected and uses the most unlikely cast of characters to do so. This method and our need to have eyes to see God's means are wonderfully summed up in the following poem of Arthur Hugh Clough. Say not the struggle naught availeth, the labor and the wounds are vain. The enemy faints not, nor faileth, and as things have been, they remain. If hopes were dupes, fears may be liars. It may be in yon smoke concealed, your comrades chase even now the flyers, and but for you possess the field. For while the tired waves, vainly breaking, seem here no painful inch to gain, far back, through creeks and inlets making, come silent, flooding in the main. And not by eastern windows only, when daylight comes in the light. In front, the sun climbs slow, how slowly, but westward look, the land is bright. We have certainly often wondered in Zimbabwe whether our struggle has been and is in vain. Often it has seemed that there's no hope in the offing. We have seen the ZANU-PF regime seemingly get away with terrible acts, including the genocide I've spoken about, and the systematic and brutal repression of democratic opposition in the last decade. Sometimes it has seemed as if God has just not been listening. But as time goes on, it is more and more apparent to me and to many that God is working slowly and deliberately in Zimbabwe. And as I've said just now, I have absolute confidence that good is slowly prevailing in Zimbabwe. But mine is a confident hope mixed with a sober realism that forceful evil men will continue to do whatever they choose until good prevails ultimately. In short, if we have eyes to see that God's kingdom is indeed forcefully advancing, that God's standards of justice are ultimately respected, if we have eyes to see, we will see that God does hear the cries of those who appeal to him against injustice. We can take heart that history shows that in his time, God and good does prevail. But, and this is a huge caveat, but through it all, we must always expect forceful men to lay hold of it. The emergence and strength of evil men and of evil regimes is part and parcel of the forceful advancement of God's kingdom. Opposition is in fact a sign that God's work is succeeding, the ultimate paradox. Violent, evil people attack God's kingdom and those who are doing his will precisely because it is forcefully advancing. And what is more, we must always expect, as individuals and as nations, a resurgence of evil. It is never fully quelled. The challenge is for the West to have more confidence in the goodness, sovereignty, and power of God, despite the presence and resurgence of evil. The West must resist the temptation to resort to the tactics of evil men, such as the use of torture and extreme force, knowing that ultimately the best way to deal with forceful men is by upholding goodness. If the West focuses consistently on using non-violent methods in the resolution of conflict, wherever possible, it will not have to spend as much on building the armories it has and in fighting many of the wars it has. Its foreign policy needs to move away from what is perceived as the pursuit of self-interest to the consistent application, and I stress that word consistent, of God's standards of morality. I use the word consistent because over the last few decades there has been a shocking inconsistency by the West in the application of international mores. Many of the wars fought by the West since the Second World War have occurred because of the appeasement and sometimes encouragement of dictatorial regimes. Since the Second World War, many corrupt and violent regimes have prospered because of either Western support or indifference. Saddam Hussein was supported by the US in his fight against Iran. The US supported the Taliban in their battle against the Russians. The cozying up by Britain to Gaddafi to secure access to Libyan oil bolstered and strengthened Gaddafi. In Zimbabwe, the West looked the other way when ZANU-PF committed a genocide in Matabeleland in the 1980s. And Britain even awarded Robert Mugabe with a knighthood in 1994. This was mainly because they were so focused on keeping Mugabe out of the Soviet sphere of influence. And in all these cases I've listed, the ultimate cost to both the West and the innocent citizens of those nations ruled by violent men has been enormous. In short, the West should never be on the side of forceful men seeking to lay hold of God's kingdom. Forceful men who are opposed to fundamental principles of morality. At the root of this is the Judeo-Christian teaching of the Psalms and of Romans 3, that there is no one who does good in the world. Or in other words, that all politicians, all military leaders throughout the world, in every country of the world, if left to their own devices, ultimately have a bias towards exploiting or abusing the power that they have to their own benefit. It was the belief of Chamberlain in the ultimate goodness of man that influenced him to appease Hitler. I reiterate that I'm not a pacifist. Using every last peaceful means to prevent war does not stem from believing that people are basically good, but rather because of the knowledge of man's propensity for evil. In this regard, the threat of war and the capacity to conduct war are necessary means to prevent forceful, violent, evil, corrupt men from achieving their goals. I have no doubt that if the West changes, it will be less likely to be dragged into the intractable messes it now finds itself in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. In saying this, I recognize that sometimes there is no choice but to intervene, as has been the case in Libya, to save the lives of innocent people. But the West needs to learn from its prior mistakes. If it does so, it will find also that it does not have to spend billions of dollars sorting out the mess created by dictatorial regimes in future. What then about existing powerful non-democratic nations run by forceful men, which the West is dependent upon for fuel or trade? In practical terms, it is very difficult for the West, of course, to avoid dealing with these nations. The West needs the fuel that comes from these nations, often needs to trade with these nations. However, I would suggest the following. Suffering for doing good is a theme in the Bible. If a nation suffers, for example, economically, for doing good, it is submitting itself to the will of God. In 1 Peter 3:17, we read, "It is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." In my own country, Zimbabwe, we have suffered for decades for doing wrong. Oppressive white minority governments, by not giving black people a fair deal, by promoting policies of racial discrimination, drove moderates in black communities to support violent and extreme nationalists. And the entire nation then suffered a decade of civil war. The greed and poor governance of the last 30 years has led to the catastrophic economic state of our country. But through it all, God has actually been faithful. And ordinary Zimbabweans, including myself, I believe, are now far wiser. They have seen the extremes of both white minority racism and black majority greed and corruption, and have opted for a peaceful solution to our problems. While we undoubtedly have a long way to go, I believe that we are now headed in a better direction than we have been in the last 50 years of our nation's history. It is still fragile. Our future is still uncertain. But I pray that by God's grace, we can now steer our nation in a peaceful transition to democracy. The point I'm simply making by coming back to Zimbabwe is that although our nation has suffered for doing wrong, our nation has come out stronger. And that was certainly the experience of post-Civil War America, and it is certainly the experience of post-apartheid South Africa. All the more so, I would argue, if the West suffers for doing good by taking a more principled stand, which may have dire economic consequences, but by taking a principled stand against all forceful men and their governments throughout the world, irrespective of their power. My third and final concern is summed up in the words, "Take the talent from him and give it to the one who has 10 talents." It is a fact that all but two of Jesus' parables are about money and possessions. God cares very deeply about the stewardship of the good gifts he gives to individuals and to nations. He desires that we use our money wisely, generously, and in the common good. The harsh reality of the world today is that there remains a huge gulf between rich and poor nations. Some of these iniquities are perpetrated by Western-dominated trade policies and by, as I've already elaborated on, a Western pursuit of self-interest. In a recent meeting I attended in Morocco regarding education in Africa, a graph was displayed which shows that Africa's tertiary institutions and their related research capacity are in fact weakening. Many of Africa's best brains end up in the West, strengthening already strong and powerful nations. At the same meeting in Morocco, it was shown that most African nations are spending far greater percentages of their national budgets on education than most Western nations. But despite that, the investment is simply not enough to enable African countries to catch up. As a result, African children, even with the best will of good governance in Africa, are lagging behind their counterparts elsewhere in the world. And it makes the prospect of African development harder to achieve. When I consider the billions of dollars spent in fighting wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, the billions of dollars spent in bailing out the AIG company, for example, in the United States, and the billions of dollars spent out bailing out profligate Greece, in relation to how much is spent by the West on education in Africa, I'm appalled. The West, I believe, has a moral duty to be better stewards of the enormous wealth it has in relation to other nations in the world. Firstly, in this regard, the amount the West spends in reducing the inequalities in the world is pitiful in relation to what it spends on defense and on itself. Denmark, which is one of the better nations, spends approximately 0.7% of its budget on development assistance. And for such a small nation, it has done remarkable things in developing poorer nations. However, nations of the world with far bigger economies than Denmark spend a fraction of that on developmental assistance. And often the assistance given is conditional upon contracts being awarded to their own nationals. Furthermore, that situation is compounded when one considers trade barriers such as the EU's protective measures and subsidies in the agriculture sector, which prevent countries, for example in Africa, from fully exploiting their comparative advantage. As stated above, if the massive amounts of money spent on military defense were reduced and reallocated to international development assistance, then targets such as the Danish target of 0.7% would be relatively easy to attain. I have no doubt that if there were this change in thinking, not only would huge strides be made towards reducing inequalities in the world, but also the world will be made a much safer place in future. Secondly, and this is critical, the West has to be wiser in how it spends developmental assistance. And the parable of the talents that I read out at the head of this section is a useful guide. As I said at the beginning of my talk, in the last 50 years of developmental assistance, the last 50 years of developmental assistance are littered with stories of aid being wasted on profligate and corrupt governments. And in many cases, there is now little to show for the literally trillions of dollars spent during that period. Far too much money has been spent on inefficient central government projects, including building up the military in corrupt states. I suspect that a vast proportion of United States assistance in both Iraq and Afghanistan has been and possibly is still being spent on building up the military in those countries, rather than on constructing schools and supporting the private sector in those countries. I can say with absolute certainty regarding Zimbabwe that when ZANU-PF was fully in power and was still in favor with the West in the 1980s and 1990s, that hundreds of millions of Western taxpayers' money was spent propping up central government, and little, if any, was spent in supporting the private sector and in promoting democracy and, for example, a private media. And I find it personally ironic that every time the police in Zimbabwe have come to arrest me in the last couple of decades, they have done so in Land Rovers supplied by the British government in the 1990s. In other words, development assistance should only be spent on governments that spend that money in the right way. If governments are faithful, to quote the Bible, in the few things, then they should be put in charge of many things, Matthew 25:23. And if governments cannot be entrusted with talents, then developmental assistance should be directed to those responsible people who live under irresponsible governments. In the 1990s, when the World Bank and the IMF were pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Zimbabwe, propping up a patently corrupt regime, we found it in the human rights community impossible to raise any money from any Western government to research and write a human rights report exposing the genocide committed by ZANU-PF in the 1980s. Eventually, it took Amnesty International and its $10,000 grant to research and write the entire Breaking the Silence report, which was produced in 1997. The point I'm simply making is that for all the millions spent in Zimbabwe during that period, the West was found wanting. Furthermore, developmental assistance needs to be more targeted, towards building the skills of the coming generation and of ensuring that there are jobs for that generation in the private sector. There needs to be a massive investment in the education sector throughout the third world, in building institutions which foster democracy, and in private sector industry and businesses. Let me conclude. There is obviously an interconnectivity between all the 3 points I've raised this evening. If the West takes dramatic steps to change its foreign policies, the world will become a better place and meaningful freedom will be realized. Western nations need to reduce their defense budgets. They need to trust more that the consistent pursuit of principle provides greater security than bombs. They need to rechannel the money saved from defense spending into reducing inequalities between nations. And in doing so, they need to be principled and firm on how and on what developmental aid and assistance is spent. Indeed, Lincoln's closing remarks in his second inaugural address are apposite. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. Thus spoke Lincoln. It will only be, ladies and gentlemen, through charity, firmness in doing right, binding of international wounds or inequalities and inequities, and care for the destitute of the world, that a just and lasting world peace, and therefore freedom, may be achieved. Thank you.
Senator Coltart and distinguished guests and friends. As Greg said at the outset, the annual lecture, Acton Lecture, is one of the principal features of the Religion and Free Society program established by the Centre for Independent Studies some years ago. And the lecture is intended primarily to address the broad theme of freedom, whether from a market or social or cultural point of view, and to do so from a religious perspective. Tonight, Senator Coltart has brought a distinctly religious perspective to one of the most vexed questions for many religious and secular communities, certainly for my own community, the Christian community, and that is the matter of aid, development aid. Questions of how much, how effective, to whom, and with what controls are pressing. And yet they tend to be second-order questions. I think that the first-order question concerning aid, both for religious institutions and for governments, is why? Only this month, the English Conservative MP David Davis argued that the so-called Arab Spring breaking around the Mediterranean must be supported with huge sums of money. He warned that the British government should not miss this important role that aid can play, not just in bringing relief from suffering and encouraging development, but also, Davis says, in protecting British interests. Aid shrewdly deployed, he said, can be both compassionate and in our national interest. I think this evening Senator Coltart has articulated a very eloquent counterposition to this point of view. The answer to the question, why development aid, is because it is just, and because aid budgets must be administered in a selfless way so as to express God's priorities, God's concern for what is equitable and what is just. He speaks from his own experience of the absence of justice over many years in his own society. He brings an African perspective, a Zimbabwean perspective, Zimbabwe being a conservative and a Christian country, if a somewhat chaotic country at the moment. Nonetheless, Senator Coltart brings to this debate his own faith, which clearly informs his values and judgments and decisions as a politician, serving incidentally as the only white member of Robert Mugabe's cabinet and as the member who represents an overwhelmingly black electorate. He calls for the community of nations to act in ways that advance the kingdom of God, by ensuring that the prevailing values of God's goodness are upheld by government and by individuals. Secularists often argue that religious views and values have no place in the public square. We know that that is the case in this country. Religious people are told that they may express their beliefs in private, but they must never expect to influence the development of public policy. Senator Coltart has shown carefully how Christian principles can and must be brought to bear as policy is formulated, that we are to aspire to the consistent application of God's standards of morality, that we are to express policy in a selfless way, we are to administer development aid in a selfless way. I'm delighted that Senator Coltart has been able to come to Sydney to give the 2011 Acton Lecture. In doing so, I think he has made a distinguished contribution to the debate about the place and importance of religious values in the public square, and if I may say so, a distinguished contribution to the revival and the renewal of the Religion and the Free Society program. I congratulate him and thank him for his paper, and it remains for me to thank you for joining us this evening at Parliament House and for your generous support over the years of the Centre for Independent Studies. Thank you.